Yeah.
Well, good
But it's
evening,
good to see
everyone.
you again.
The time is 13 minutes to 8. We are going to go live in about 13 minutes time, and we are joined by a remarkable and illustrious panel from all over the world who we'll introduce you to in a few minutes time. But most importantly, for those people who kept Shabbat, Shavua Tov, Guten Wocht, we'd love to know where in the world you are. We've, to the panelists who haven't been on the panel before, we've developed an unbelievable following in places like Brazil and Argentina, Costa Rica, the United States, Canada, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. People tune in from throughout the world. We're big in Europe as well. This is going to be one of our largest panels that we've ever actually done. So we want to welcome everyone. It's amazing to see you all. In the chat section, please tell us where in the world you are. I see we've already got some people in Southern California who told us. We've got lots of people in Toronto. We see the Joffeys are in Toronto, some people in Cape Town. Lorraine Siv is in Cape Town. We've got in Netanya, we've got Elaine and Sam. And if you guys look in the chat section, you'll see from all over the world where people are greeting us from. Renana, Delray Beach, Cape Town. The Sifrins are in Cape Town. We have people in Florida. Ari, you have to tell us if that's Florida in Gauteng or if that's Florida in the United States. And we have people in Lucia. I see lots of people in Texas, Durban, Gallo Manor. People have joined us from all over the world. Currently on Zoom alone, we have about 1,500 people watching us on Zoom. And an interesting thing, we believe we are in fact running the biggest Zoom panels in South Africa at the moment. We think our content has been absolutely remarkable, and people are talking about us because there is literally no one who is attracting the sort of audiences that we are to this alternative to normal television. So Derek, I'm terribly sorry. We don't want to actually put you out of a job.
No, you're right. But that's a big audience, Howard, because I've been doing property webinars. And they started off, with some good figures, but recently have dropped to like 200-300. So what you're getting here is amazing. Shows you the interest, and it's worldwide, which is fantastic.
Which is really fantastic. Now, Derek, people will hear your story a little later, but I think a lot of people have sat next to you on aeroplanes.
And told me their stories.
But also, you're a very large man. It is very hard for you to fit into an airplane seat. How tall are you?
And they used to call me the Kalahari Kid. A long stretch of F4. I'm actually 6'6".
My goodness, that's really, really tall. We should compare probably heights, but my guess is the shortest person who's joined us this evening could very well be Martin Sweet. Martin, good evening to you.
Hi, Howie. Thank you so much. Nice to see you all. And Derek, great to see you again.
Great to see you again, Martin. Wow. Been a while.
Martin, you are a short man, but a man of great stature. But what the other panelists don't know is that whatever we do, we try to add in some good. So in fact, Martin, tell us a little about what you're doing at your webinar. We're going to tell us more shortly after 8 o'clock, but you're with Prime Stars. You've been with Prime Stars for quite a while. Tell us about what you're actually doing and what the organization does. And we're going to recap in a little less detail just after 8 o'clock as well.
Well, thank you, Howie. Well, Prime Stars educates 90,000 learners a year. We educate learners in maths and science, financial literacy, career guidance, entrepreneurship, across the country, and we bus learners in on a Saturday and Sunday, and we'll be able to do this again from the middle of September. As you know, private schools are using technology. Public schools are facing huge difficulties with connectivity and data, with tablets. They don't have tablets. Teacher training is not up to date. There's been school vandalism and theft. So the Minister of Basic Education has asked us once again to utilize cinemas, the big screen, to take learners through the maths and science program. And it's very exciting because they come to 10 sessions. We've been moving learners up by 20% across the board, and it's been very successful. Impact has been great, and we're able again to do it this year with particular reference to the matric class and saving the class of 2020. They've only had 4 months of maths education, and we're hoping that by coming to the cinemas, doing revision programs with us, and having some of the best teachers on screen, they'll be able to catch up and do better. So that's, and be COVID ready, you know.
But Martin, very importantly, we're asking the question, can the class of 2020 be saved? Realistically, can it, or is this year a complete write-off?
Well, I think, you know, we have to save the class of 2020. There's no option. We have to go about helping these learners pass, because next year, the classes are already 20 to 30 people in a class. You don't want 60 people in a class. And the matriculants are going back. They're back at school already. This was last week. There's a week where all the matriculants were there. Schools are working day and night to try and get their learners to pass. So my view is we can still save the majority of public school learners and help them pass. We have to.
Well, you've got a webinar coming up, which we're going to talk about just after 8 o'clock, but thank you so much for joining us. Where's Nkosinathi? He was going to join us as well. Is he with you?
Right here, and he'd love to say hi and talk to you.
Good evening, everybody. How's it, Howard? Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the platform. Evening, everyone.
Evening, Nkosinathi. And tell us, so in your view, can the class of 2020 be saved?
Absolutely. I think I agree with Martin. We have no choice. We're not saying that we're going to be able to change the entire status, but we've got to make an impact. We've got to make an effort. Our standpoint comes from the multiplier effect of not at least supporting the class of 2020 from public schools, that is. We know what happens if young people lose a year. We know the rates of dropouts. We know the multiplier effect of unemployment, not going into school, and long-term being dependent on government. And that's what we're trying to avoid to the best of our ability. So platforms like these are absolutely phenomenal and incredible. We do have some partners, but we need more to make a real impact on the ground this year.
Great, guys. We'll chat to you just after 8 o'clock. But tell us, Martin and Nkosinathi, where are you joining us from? Where in the world are you guys?
We are in Johannesburg, in Oakland.
In Oakland, crispy, fantastic. And crispy and cold. Saxon, where in the world are you?
In Cape Town, Howard. And I'd just like to say to all those, I hope you all had a good Shabbos.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What's the weather like in Cape Town at the moment?
It's actually quite wild outside. Lots of wind, and I believe a storm is on its way. But it sounds frightfully British to talk about the weather on an occasion like this. I'd like to say thank you very much for organizing it, Howard.
Absolute pleasure, Saxon. We've got to...
I'm delighted I have two of my stars on here, John Swain and Dave Kaplan. And Lynette, I would like to say that we did try to contact you, but I think sadly we only got hold of you too late for you to take part.
Well, Saxon, you will hear amazing stories tonight. Let's just find out where everyone in the world is quickly. Derek, you, I presume, are in Johannesburg.
All the way from Bryanston.
All the way from Bryanston. With, you know, remember the days when you would have to have a truck with a satellite dish on top in order to broadcast all the way from Bryanston? How times have changed.
Absolutely. And I mean, my brother was saying Rivonia in those days, it was only a dirt road out there with the post office and a one spa, I think. So things have changed a bit. Should have bought lots of property then.
There was a dirt road and no street lights actually until when?
Absolutely.
The 1980s was the first time Sandton allowed street lights.
Yeah.
And David Kaplan, where in the world do you join us from?
Howard, is this in-house chit chat? I mean, this is not being aired, is it?
No, this is being aired. This is being aired. We have already over 2,000 people watching us on Zoom. I haven't checked on YouTube. We are now full
watching.
On Zoom. We have many more thousands watching us on YouTube as well. We're expecting an audience tonight of well over 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people which we'll be able.
So we've started already. Is that right?
Yes, we are going
We're
live
warming up.
formally in 5 minutes.
We're
But
warming up.
everyone is busy watching us. They can see you. They can hear you. Your hairstyle is looking absolutely magnificent.
Well, there we go.
It's mine, all right.
So, I'm speaking from Israel.
From where in Israel are you, David?
I'm in Kfar Saba.
You're in Kfar Saba. Great. Well, welcome. You've got an
Thank you.
important part of the story to tell us.
Absolutely.
And John Swain, where in the world do you join us from?
John? Hello?
Hi, John. Where in the world do you join us from?
I'm in London, England, at this moment.
Fantastic. So given what Saxon told us, we feel morally obliged to ask you what the weather is like in London.
I was going to say, being Brit, I can tell you it's pretty gloomy here today, but it's been very hot during the week.
Of course,
degrees.
we in South Africa presume it's gloomy all the time in London.
That's fair enough. I sort of share your view, actually.
Lynette de Villiers.
Howard, I think I'm the only one who hasn't commented about the weather. So it's very hot here in Israel, both climatically and politically.
Are there protests against your prime minister tonight?
Yes, in Kfar Saba tonight on the beach, about a kilometer away from us, over 500 as of an hour ago.
Oh, wow. Quite amazing. Lynette, I'm asking to unmute you. We'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from. And while you do that, it's 1 minute to 8. We're going live in exactly 3 minutes time. And we want to welcome everyone this evening. We've reached our capacity of 1,000 people on Zoom. So if you know anyone who's still trying to join us, please ask them to go over to our YouTube channel. We can in fact accommodate unlimited numbers of people on our YouTube channel. So if you know of people trying to get in, please send them there. But unfortunately, Zoom is now completely full. Lynette, unmute yourself, please.
Sorry.
There you are, Lynette. Welcome. Lovely to have you with us. You join us from where in the world?
Franschhoek, Cape.
I presume that means you're close to some of the vines. And can you get us some alcohol to the side of the world?
I'm afraid not. Sadly not.
No. But after the show, we can arrange something.
And also joining us this evening is Petter Krost-Maunter. So Petter,
yes.
You are editor of the Jewish Report, the newspaper of which I'm chairperson. You see it behind me over there. But Petter, were you not Derek's boss?
Well, I was kind of.
She was.
I was. He was.
And she
he
was quite tough at times.
I was. But I was kind too, I'm sure.
No, she was great. Petter was absolutely great. She was tough, but she was fair. And I remember the only time she lost her temper a little bit was when I was playing a squash tournament in East London, and Petter felt that I should actually be in Joburg presenting carte blanche.
Are you a decent squash? Are you a decent squash player, Derek?
Yeah, I used to play quite good league. Yeah, I played Joburg Second League and Durban First League, but not great shakes. You know, guy of my length trying to get around a court is not a pleasant sight, hey? Especially the guys who play those little drop shots.
Now, Dave Kaplan, just before we begin, I see you logged in twice, which I presume means you've given your panelist details to someone. So I'm going to send one of you off into the audience. I hope I select the right person. If by some chance I select the wrong person, Dave, I'm going to ask you to rejoin again.
Okay.
So you might all disappear.
Yep, I selected the wrong Dave Kaplan to send into the audience. So I'm going to now bring Dave Kaplan back.
I think it's much better being a guest on these Zoom webinars. But I'm to fight the switchboard there.
It's not so easy, let me tell you.
I'm sure.
Okay, we will need to try find David Kaplan.
The right David Kaplan.
The correct David Kaplan, and we need to boot out the incorrect David Kaplan. This is what happens, you know, when you send people a link and say, do not share it.
My wife was trying to pinch my link. I said, no ways, this is unique.
This is, Derek, everything you do is unique. How long have you been in broadcasting for?
Well, in broadcasting since 1982, but with carte blanche for 32 years.
Wow, that's a, and this
started at the age of 16, Howard.
Carte blanche is surely the longest running program on television.
Yeah, I think it is. I think somebody claimed that Noord for Noord had been going longer, but I don't think they had a continuous run. But yeah, I think as a documentary, investigative reporting program, yeah, I think we have been going the longest. Very fortunate, very privileged, and yeah, been a wonderful journey, must say.
Amazing.
I had fun there.
Well, Peter, you were great then, and do you miss us?
Derek, I miss you always, always. We had fun.
No, we did. And it's, I think it's the vibrance of that team. It's the passion of that team, and that keeps us going. And I think that's an excuse for them not paying us. But yeah, I really still enjoy it.
Did you?
We lost David.
Well, good evening, everyone. The time is exactly 2 minutes past 8. A huge welcome to everyone. We're at our full capacity of 1,000 people on Zoom. Everyone else is spilling over onto YouTube, and we're expecting an audience tonight of 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people busy watching us tonight. So a huge welcome to you all. If you haven't told us where in the world you're watching us from, we would love to hear about it. So please have a look at the column on the side, which is the chat column. Post in where in the world you're joining us from. And I see we're joined from many people from all over the world. We'd love to know who you are and where you're from. So please communicate with us. It's a wonderful evening. Tonight we have a set of remarkable stories we're going to tell you. But before we begin, I want to welcome and introduce Danny Kadar, the CEO of the South African Jewish Report. Danny, raise your hand and wave at everyone. Danny will be on control. Danny will be on controls this evening. Danny, thank you for doing that. And before we begin, we just want to give a huge thanks to Mantis, one of our supporters and in fact advertisers for this evening. So Danny, please, let's see Mantis's advert. Thank you to Mantis. Really appreciate the support that you've shown us during this time period. A huge thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening. As we mentioned before, if anyone is speaking to you and telling you that they can't get into Zoom, that is correct. We're at our capacity of 1,000 logins, about 2,200 people on Zoom. Everyone else is in fact spilling over onto YouTube. So if anyone asks you, please tell them to go over to our YouTube channel. It's the SA Jewish Report YouTube channel, and you'll be able to continue to watch us there. So just a very quick reminder, we are still publishing the Jewish Report newspaper. You see the headline behind me. We have the editor of the Jewish Report, Peter Crossmonda, on the panel this evening. Peter is probably the best editor in all of South Africa. If you haven't yet got your copy of the Jewish Report newspaper, you should find it in your local Spar, Woolworths, Checkers, Pick and Pay hypermarket. You should be able to find it anywhere there, but we also publish online. So don't forget, you can go to www.sajr.co.za. You can look at each of the individual articles, or alternatively, you can in fact download the entire edition. Also, very importantly for everyone to realize is that we're in the season where we're looking at nominations for Jewish Achiever Awards. So the Jewish Achiever Awards is our big fundraising charity event that's going to be taking place just after Sukkot this year. And we are looking for nominations for the 9 categories that we have. So you'll see adverts all over the place, but the place to go is to www.JAA2020, which obviously stands for Jewish Achiever Awards 2020.co.za, and you can nominate people, whether it's Lifetime Achievement Award or Woman in Leadership Award or Entrepreneur Award or Humanitarian or Community Service. All of that, all of those nominations, you can in fact get back, you can in fact be able to see there. And I see David Kaplan's having some difficulties getting hold of us. So Danny, I'm going to ask you to resend a link to David Kaplan in one moment time. But I also want to thank tonight, I want to thank a new member of the team, and that's Pam May Roberts. We've been doing a lot of video editing. I've been attempting to do video editing with absolutely no skill whatsoever. And Pam May Roberts, in fact, has volunteered to do an amazing amount of video editing. And so a huge thank you to her. You're going to be seeing all of her work this evening. Pam, a huge thank you for what, in fact, you're doing for all of us. And now, Peter, I'm going to, in fact, spotlight you while Danny tries to get hold of David.
Okay.
And we're going to talk about our next webinar, which is on Thursday evening. Tell us what we're looking at on Thursday evening.
Okay, so as we know, in South Africa, we've managed to evade terrorism for a long, long time. But as time goes on, we keep getting indications that ISIS is in South Africa or moving quite rapidly in here. And just 2 weeks ago, the police raided a property in South Africa, in the south of Johannesburg. And this was in response to a kidnapping of a 72-year-old Indian national. When they raided the house, they found a lot of material that was linked to the international terror group ISIS. In fact, one of the people arrested was linked to another case that was a terror attack on a mosque in Verulam. So we've had 4 or 5 cases that have been directly or indirectly linked to ISIS. And so on Thursday night, we're going to have a look at this. We're going to bring out the experts, and we're going to see what really the threat is for us in South Africa.
So tell us a little about the experts that you're actually going to be bringing on.
Okay, so we've got Jasmine Opperman, who is a director of Africa at the Terror Research and Analysis Consortium, otherwise known as TRAC. And she's an analyst at the Islamic Theology of Counterterrorism. And she's really, this is her expertise. This is what she knows about. And one who is the senior training coordinator on terrorism and explosive-related incidents at the Transnational Threats and Internet. Oof, goodness, he's at the ISS, and this is his expertise. Okay, and Ryan Cummings is also an expert in this, and all these people have focused their research focused their research in terror and terrorism on the African continent. We also will be speaking to a representative from the CSO who, well, I don't think I need to explain who the CSO are, but they will be able to tell you exactly how threatening it is to us as the Jewish community.
Fantastic. So Thursday evening, 8 o'clock, we're going to be talking about ISIS in South Africa, a really important topic. Petter, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. We'll see you again on Thursday evening.
Great, fabulous.
And now, let us explain to everyone that at the bottom of your screen, you will see a number of buttons, and one of those buttons says chat. What we've done is really we've created a town square where people can come and complain and kibitz and talk to each other and participate and busk and sing and have a virtual cup of coffee. And that's in the chat button over there. So if you're on Zoom, please feel free to use the chat button. If you would like to ask a question to any of our panelists, you will see there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to use that Q&A button as well, and we should be able to answer or ask your question to any of the panelists on the screen as well using that Q&A button. If you're on Zoom, Danny Kadar will in fact be watching the questions on Zoom and hopefully bringing them over from, on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, Danny Kadar will be watching the Q&A section there, the comment section, post a question in there. He'll bring it over to Zoom, and let's make sure we can have a decent conversation as well. And with that, I would like to, in fact, welcome Martin Sweet. Martin, you're with an organization called Prime Stars. You're sitting there with Nkosinathi, and you, in fact, are trying to save the class of 2020. Won't you tell us about it?
Well, good evening to everyone watching tonight. And thank you, Howie, for giving us an opportunity to talk about a webinar that we're going to be holding on Thursday, the 13th of August at lunchtime from 1 to 2, focusing on saving the class of 2020 with the Minister of Basic Education and prominent business leaders from a host of major companies like Sanlam, Omnia, Sasria, Celsey, Bidvest, and Discovery. The webinar will focus on the challenges faced by public schools, connectivity and data. They don't have data, they have no tablets or very few. There's teacher training that has to take place. There's school vandalism and anxiety and depression amongst the learners. And all this goes to exacerbate inequality in the schools. Now, as you know, Prime Stars uses cinemas, Ster-Kinekor cinemas, as theatres of learning. We've been in operation for 12 years. We bus learners on weekends, Saturdays and Sundays. Last year, we touched the lives of 90,000 learners, and we focus on financial literacy, career guidance, entrepreneurship, and maths and science. Now, the private sector who support us, they get BE accreditation, socio-economic development points, enterprise development points, and they get an 18A tax deduction if they support the Youth Start Foundation. So we take care of social distancing in the cinemas. We offer the learners PPE. We ensure that they're all sanitized. And basically, the cinemas are air conditioned. So please visit our website at www.primestars.co.za if you'd like to support this worthy cause and help us in creating opportunity for sustainable change in the education space to build a more prosperous future for the generation of tomorrow. That's really, I'd like to hand you over now to Nkosinathi Mashwana, who's the head of the Youth Start Foundation.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Howard, and good evening to everyone. I know we're on limited time, so I just quickly like to mention that the Saving the Class of 2020 campaign is a full math and science curriculum program focused on matriculants from public schools. Our efforts are to support as many young people as possible. We currently have 20,000 seats available nationally, and we'd like to bring more young people into this process to do our best in ensuring that the pipeline of critical skills in South Africa continues to be supported and supplied into. Our work is social compact, and for anyone who's looking to support us now and in the future, there is a wallet doc link right up front at the moment, but we would love for you to join us on the webinar on Thursday next week in Saving the Class of 2020, which is a public-private partnership. Then please do join us on our website, check us out, and thank you once again to the Jewish Report and to Mr. Sackstein for this fantastic platform. Everyone, please enjoy your evening. We're looking forward to it ourselves.
Thank you so much, guys, and really appreciate the amazing work that you guys are actually doing. Danny, if you will stop sharing your screen, that would be very helpful. And just before we begin, we'd like to show you the final advert for this evening, and that's in fact from Switchmark Technologies.
Have they switched?
They're trying to switch.
There we go.
So much for technology, hey?
That's what makes webinars
Thank you, Danny. Thank you so much. So good evening to everyone and a huge welcome. So this is, of course, Women's Month. And what we did on Thursday evening was celebrate some remarkable women in our community. And we interviewed people like Wendy Applebaum and Jill Marcus, and we brought them to you to speak about their remarkable stories. And tonight we wanted to continue that with telling yet another remarkable story, a story that is really unknown to almost everyone within South Africa. And what more appropriate time to tell a story of a remarkable woman during Women's Month. And there is much of the story we would love to tell you that we just can't, because we honestly just don't know. If you go to the Mossad Spy Museum in Israel, you will in fact discover that the page about Sylvia Raphael is basically empty. All that you will find will be a tribute by her husband Aeneas, a tribute to his wife. So tonight you will hear from people who knew Sylvia. You will see parts of a documentary put together by Sackstein, and we will talk about what we know and what we've gleaned from the internet and from books and from people who knew her. And we will narrate a story of probably the most successful spy in South African history. In Israeli history. And it just so happened she was a South African who came from Graaff-Reinet. Now, tonight would not be possible without two people. The first person is in fact Leanne Copenhagen, who 4 years ago invited me over and screened me Sackstein's documentary about Sylvia together with Bunty, Sylvia's brother. And Leanne has been pursuing the story and encouraging people to learn and understand the story for the last 4 years. And the other person who has made this possible is in fact Dorothy Sank and the Sampson family, because when a few weeks ago I called up Dorothy and I said, I want to tell the story to the people of South Africa of Sylvia Raphael, and I need your help. Dorothy did whatever it took to make sure that this evening we would be sitting here tonight. And so I want to start off by asking the people on our panel what their connection, in fact, is to Sylvia. And Derek, let's start with you. What on earth are you doing on this panel?
Good question, Howard. And yeah, it goes back to growing up in Bulawayo. And I think I was about maybe 8 or 10 years old. And as kids do, you rifle through your parents' drawers to see what's in there. And there I saw a little note about a change of name, that the family name had been changed from Raphael to Watts. But for those who are like myself, I never say I'm old, I say I'm chronologically gifted. So those who are also gifted, well, remember parents then didn't talk a lot to their kids. And it's just amazing that my father, Basil, who was the most amazing father, supported me in everything I did, never once discussed his background, never discussed his family, not once in the time that I knew him. And eventually, after many years, I spoke to my brother, I saw this change of name. And he said, yeah, no, he was actually born Roy Raphael. And at some stage, they changed the name to Watts, which was Ferdy's first wife's maiden name, Anne Watts. And yeah, that's how it happened. So it was just one of those big secrets in the family. It had nothing to do with her being with the Mossad. It was just, I think that my father fell out with Ferdy. I've spoken to Bunty about it. I spoke to Sylvia about it. Just to be honest about it, the story came through my mother that when Roy was born, he went back to see Ferdy, who he'd fallen out with because obviously he'd remarried and left his first wife, which is my father's mother, and took Roy there to see Ferdy. And Ferdy kicked him out of the house, didn't want anything to do with him. Now, that's that side of the story. But what I've found is from Bunty and all the family, that there are different versions. And you can understand that, Howard. You know, we knew Ferdy Raphael at different times. And so there are different stories. But that's the relationship. And
so tonight we're talking about Auntie Sylvia.
We're talking about Auntie Sylvia, but there's a big gap between that conversation with my brother then and him telling me that we were Raphaels and that she was with the Mossad, she was a spy. And between that and me eventually meeting up with Sylvia, but maybe we'll tell that story a bit later. I don't want to hog the show, so to speak.
I'm sure we will. David Kaplan, welcome back. Nice to have you back with us. We've got the real David Kaplan with us this time.
Right.
David, how on earth did you get alerted to the story?
Okay, before I answer that, let me just preface by saying the following. You know, people come to webinars because they're informational and they expect to be informed. And I do suspect that people will leave tonight's webinar with more questions than answers. And I think that's only right because we are dealing here with the furtive world. And sometimes it's important, in the words of the great architect Mies van der Rohe, that less is more. You know, I have a friend who's in the Shabak or was in the Shabak, and I'm dealing with daily terrorism on the streets of Israel. And if he had a good day, the next day you would read nothing. And if he had a bad day, you would read something. So often it's more important that we know less than more. And therefore, I think that we're going to leave tonight's webinar not so much with knowledge of operational detail, but a sense of who Sylvia Raphael was. Who was this person? What kind of a person was she to become this incredible person so committed to the salvation of the Jewish people and Israel? Having said that, let me answer your question. How did I come to be involved in the Sylvia saga? I'm a journalist. In 2005, I opened up the newspaper and I see they tucked away on page 3 very inconspicuous, a brief article, no photograph. And he talks about a funeral that happened the day before at a kibbutz, Ramat HaKodesh, only 4 or 5 kilometers of where I live in Kfar Saba. So there is my initial interest. I then see that she's from South Africa, being a South African, more interest. I read on that she was a Mossad agent, had been a Mossad agent, and was involved in the botched operation in Lillehammer that was connected to the Munich massacre of 1972. But no further details in this article. Okay. It then doesn't say, but it alludes that she wasn't Jewish. So all this is super interesting. And I then come to the next line, which for me was most illuminating and instructive. It then said that at the funeral, the entire area was cordoned off by the police. What did this mean? It meant that attending the funeral was the who's who of the Israeli security and intelligence community. They obviously didn't want people to attend the funeral. They most certainly didn't want the media, and they didn't want people asking any questions. Now, all this, it was like feeding me with all this kind of information, and I was hungry for more, like the red rag to the journalist Gallic Bull. I needed to know more. So the first thing I started doing was scanning the other papers. And I saw in the other daily Israeli, Indian Graaff-Reinet, a quote from Eitan Harbor. I don't know if you're familiar with Eitan Harbor. Eitan Harbor was a great friend of Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister, his confidant and advisor. But more than all that, he was a writer on matters pertaining to security. And in Idiot Ochronot, Eitan Harbor wrote the following. This is the day after the funeral. And he writes, and I quote, "One day when true peace comes, they will be writing books about Sylvia, make movies about her life, and name streets after her." Well, they haven't named streets, but most certainly they've now written books and there's movies. This got me going. So I immediately phoned up the Jerusalem Post and I said, can I write I saw your article, can I write a more detailed article? I'll have it ready in a week. Now, clearly in a week, I'm not going to be able to write an article that's going to be dealing with too much operational details. But I wanted to find out who this person was. What was she all about? That she wasn't Jewish and risked life and limb for the salvation of the Jewish people in Israel. So the first thing I did was I phoned up a brother Bunty, David Raphael, and he told me some background about the family, how they were brought up and raised in Graaff-Reinet, and gave me a lot of details, which I'm sure you'll be hearing tonight. And then I phoned up her husband, who was at the time living in Pretoria, Anais Schultz. Now, not only was her husband, Anais was her lawyer at the trial in Norway, who defended her, and he must have been a very good lawyer because they were fearing a life sentence, and she only got 18 months. So I asked Anais, tell me a little bit about Sylvia, and this is what he said, and I quote, "She was a gifted woman, quick-witted, and well qualified to do whatever was expected of her. I still do not know as her lawyer and as her husband what she had done prior to the business in Norway." I like his choice of words, business in Norway. He was a consummate professional. She would never speak to me about her Mossad past. All I know, it was extremely dangerous. And dangerous it was, because she went into that furtive world. And I submitted my article, it appeared a week later, and that was the first of many articles that I had written. But I never used the term, as is sometimes mentioned, that she was a killer. Not at all. And my articles were all on the basis of service in the shadows, because that was what was it all about. She was serving her country, and she was serving it in the shadows.
Dave, we're going to hear much more about that. Let's quickly ask Saxon. Saxon, tell us, what is your connection to the story?
Well, I pay homage to Derek. In fact, I'll take the opportunity of dedicating the film to you, Derek. No, Derek and I go way back to Bulawayo days. Our parents were very good friends, and we went to school together. And when I settled in Cape Town, I made contact with Derek because I thought that it would be really a good idea if he and I worked together on, I wanted to do something more substantial than his work on Carte Blanche. I felt like we ought to do a big story, and we would meet and discuss various options. And he called on me when he was filming in Cape Town, and came round to our apartment in Greenpoint. And while I was fixing him some coffee,
I think it was more than coffee, Saxon.
I think it was more than coffee. All right, Derek, don't split on me. Anyway, he looked up at the bookshelf and said, "My goodness, I didn't realize you're Jewish, Saxon." And I said, "Well, I'm not." And he said, "Well, why have you got the Jewish Book of Why on your bookshelf?" And I said, "Well, my partner's Jewish." And he then started to talk about his aunt, and he divulged that he had found out through this very complex Nabokov-like family history, and revealed that his aunt had worked for Mossad. And I believe, Derek, I'm not sort of quoting a myth here, but you did mention that just before she was dying, you really wanted to know the depth of her work. And she beckoned you over to talk to you and said, "If I told you, I'd have to kill you."
Not far from the truth, Saxon.
Thank
But
you.
in fact, my brother was going to actually write her memoirs. Roy,
Yeah, well,
you met Roy, and he and actually Bunty reminded me of that yesterday, that she was going to tell Roy her life story, but I think we all know it wouldn't have been the full story.
Well, you know, I think that my film comes pretty close to covering her narrative. You know, David's quite right that you can't know everything and you can't find out everything, but you know, we found out a substantial amount. My biggest problem, referring to Dorothy Sank and of course Len Sank, is that when I pitched the idea, I found that I was immediately funded and had to get going because Bunty was going to an old school reunion at Graaff-Reinet, and I thought that would be an opportunity to film with Bunty, showing us where they were brought up, and also that Bunty, in many ways, whichever way you cut it, was sort of kind of his sister's repository. You know, he knew more than most people about what his sister got up to.
So, Saxon, let's leave it there because we're going to come to many of those stories in a few moments, but let us introduce one or two of our other guests. So joining us from London is in fact John Swain. Now, John, people don't realize, but you are probably one of the most famous journalists in the world. In fact, the Killing Fields movie about Cambodia, is that not about you?
Well, it is about me, but it's about, more importantly, it's about New York Times correspondent Sidney Schanberg. I mean, it's really his story, and his Cambodian interpreter, Dit Pran. I'm a character because I was there at the time, and so I'm played in the film. I'm the person who tried to save Dit Pran's life by having I had two British passports, doctoring one to try and save his life and make him out to be a Nepalese instead of a Cambodian. When Phnom Penh fell and the Khmer Rouge were making all the Cambodians who were taking shelter with us in the French embassy leave and go out to almost certain death out into the countryside. So that was my time in Cambodia.
And now you're with us this evening because, in fact, you and Sylvia had a relationship in Paris, did you not?
Yes, we did. I mean, to put it very simply, and I hope not crudely, I was in fact, I suppose, unwittingly a victim of a Mossad honey trap. I met Sylvia as a very young journalist in 1969 when I was working in Paris for Agence France Presse. And I was friends with a lot of British journalists who were there. And at a party one evening, which I was invited to, I met Sylvia, and she was 10 years older than me, or nearly, I think. So I was anyway, we became enamored and we became lovers. But I had no idea that she was Sylvia Raphael, of course, because she was posing as a Canadian freelance photographer called Patricia Roxburgh. If she had a South African accent, speaking English, I'm afraid at that time when I was ignorant, I couldn't tell it. So anyway, she was passed herself off as a freelance photographer working for a famous, as a freelance photographer working for a famous French photo agency called Agence Delmas. Anyway, we became very close. You know, Paris was the city of light and love, and so it was a very natural thing to get together. Now the question is, I suppose you might ask, you know, was I being? I think she wanted an entree into the Anglo-Saxon press corps in Paris. I mean, from a Mossad point of view, I mean, I'm putting this together afterwards with the benefit of hindsight, because myself and none of my colleagues had any idea that of her real identity, or that she, while a freelance photographer, that was a legend, and in fact she was an agent of the Israeli Secret Service. So the question is, you know, although we were genuinely lovers, to what extent was I perhaps being used as a entry point to other things? I honestly will never know. But she, as I recall, I mean, we did all the usual things. We went to nice restaurants. There's one favorite place we went to called the Petite Chaise, which is behind near the Place Saint-Germain on the left bank of Paris. We went to nightclubs occasionally, a place called Castell's. We had a nice time in Paris, but she would, you know, she wasn't always there. She would just sort of suddenly say, I'm going on a photographic assignment. I'll be back in a few days, and a few days might turn out to be a couple of weeks or so. So in that respect, she wasn't entirely reliable, but she had other things on her mind, I think.
So we're going to come back to tell that story. And Lynette, we're going to come to you in 1 second, but we're going to start with the story of Graaff-Reinet, where you in fact met Sylvia, and let's see a little bit about the beginnings.
Born in Graaff-Reinet, a small but wealthy farming town on April Fool's Day in 1937, Sylvia Raphael was reared familiar with this vastly beautiful but harsh landscape of semi-desert scrubland. Sylvia was also becoming familiar with other imagery, news from Europe that told her she was living in an age of terror. This is where Sylvia's story begins. Her mother ensured Sylvia was raised within a strictly observant Dutch Reformed household. Yet her father was Jewish.
It's your church.
My church.
Sylvia's church.
As well, she got baptized here and confirmed. This is the Graaff-Reinet Advertiser, the local newspaper. My father was editor. He also met my mother. My mother was a secretary here. He was not a Zionist. I never heard a Zionist thing out of his mouth in my life. But it was whispered he was an atheist.
Sylvia graduated as a teacher, yet longed to be an actress. She became engaged to Tony, then a manager of a provincial Southern African hotel. Tony was transferred to London, and Sylvia accompanied him. She got a job as a secretary in the city. She noticed with alarm that what was regarded as social drinking in Southern Africa had for Tony become heavy drinking. She broke off the engagement. Tired of English weather, and like many young people in the early 60s, she was drawn to a more equitable life among the kibbutzim in Israel.
So in fact, Lynette, there is probably no one who has known Sylvia longer than yourself. Tell us about Sylvia.
Well, Sylvia and I met for the first time in kindergarten. So we spent many years together in serious competition, always. And we became friends because her mother, Miriam, used to make the most divine sandwiches for her lunch. And I was in the boarding house, so I used to drool over Sylvia's lunch boxes. And she started sharing them with me. And from then, we started a friendship. And we grew together through school, always in competition. And part of what I'm going to tell you later will be the things that she got up to at school.
So what was she like?
Well, she always was different. She was different. She was taller than most of the girls. She was striking, very striking, long black hair, always flowing around. And she had a repartee of note, strong, very witty. She had an answer for everything, pulled the legs of the nuns like nobody's business, and kept everybody in fits of laughter during class and everything, as she did eventually in her own trial. She kept the whole court in fits of laughter.
So Bunty told me a story that although they were members of the Dutch Reformed Church, she was in fact sent to Catholic school, and that she would arrive late for school every single day, and the nuns would berate her, and every day she would come up with a new amazing story that the nuns finally just gave up because these stories were so fantastical that the nuns actually enjoyed listening to the stories of why she was late on that occasion.
Absolutely, that's exactly what I mean. She always had an answer, and she was always very funny and kept everybody entertained.
So you and Sylvia, in fact, worked at the movie house together. Sylvia's father, Ferdinand, in fact, owned the movie house in Graaff-Reinet. Was that correct?
He did. Sylvia's father was a strict, highly educated Jewish gentleman. He didn't get himself involved in us children at all. It wasn't part of his thing. He didn't really get involved in anything very much. He had his own, he was involved in his own things. And he was 20 years, I think, older than Sylvia's mother. And she did all the running around and so on. She was an Afrikaans girl. The fact that both Sylvia and I were at a Catholic school had nothing to do with being Catholic. It had to do with whether you could get a place in there was only one other English-speaking school. And even though Sylvia's mother was Afrikaans and she got, as you said, baptized and everything else in the Dutch Reformed Church, she was not she did not stay Dutch Reformed as a religion, Sylvia, I mean. And she certainly wasn't Catholic, as I wasn't either. In my case, it was a question of, we lived on a farm, we arrived in the area, I needed to go to school, and I couldn't get a place at the Union High, which was the only English-speaking school, so I ended up at the convent. And well, it was a very lucky thing for both of us. I can't remember the reason that she ended up there, but it had nothing to do with religion at all. In the end, when she went to Israel, it was because she went to look for her roots. So after university, she wanted to go and see. She identified with her father far more than with her Afrikaans heritage. Maybe Banti disagrees with me, but that's certainly what I found. And so she went to work on the kibbutz. That's what she wanted to do, and got herself headhunted.
Lynette, one of the things you told me is that the two of you, in fact, worked at the movie house because you like to look at the boys.
Well, that is true. We did. We used to take every opportunity, because her dad owned well, it wasn't called a movie house in those days, it was the Bioscope. So we took every opportunity to go and work behind the counter at selling tickets, movie tickets. And it was to see the boys. And and we used to do that. And we were movie crazy, absolutely movie crazy, as I think lots of young people were in those days. And so when Sylvia eventually became a spy and told me about it, I at first thought that she was playing a movie role in her head. So anyway.
So Saxon, you in fact said to me that when you spoke to people, people always described Sylvia as different. That she would walk down the passages at school reciting Shakespeare and Latin. What did people mean when they told you that Sylvia was just unique and different?
I think for the very reason that Lynette has mentioned. She was obviously a highly attractive young woman. And certainly in her senior years, we've heard, and I can only say this anecdotally because I don't know for sure, she went to Rhenish, and she loved Shakespeare. And I think that's a lot to do with her ability to play roles, is she loved the theatre and she loved acting. And, had she not gone to Rhodes and studied in education, she I think would have liked a career on the stage. She knew Shakespeare, and she would wander down the corridors spouting soliloquies from Shakespeare and speaking Latin. But I don't think that she was ever a show-off. She was just charismatic.
So one of the things, Melanie Halberstadt, who is now Melanie Brook and watching us in Israel, Melanie Brook, and she told me the story that they were, of course, at school together, and that Melanie's father, in fact, was the most religious Jew in Graaff-Reinet. So he led the Friday night synagogue services. He taught people their bar mitzvah portions. And Sylvia arrives one day and says, I actually want to learn Hebrew. I want to get in touch with my roots. And in fact, Manfred Halberstadt teaches her Hebrew. And within 6 months, Sylvia is in fact fluent in Hebrew. And Manfred invites Sylvia over for Shabbat dinner. And she arrives for the first time at the Halberstadts for Shabbat dinner. And what happens is Manfred Halberstadt decides to, in fact, play a joke on her. And he borrows a lawyer's wig, one of those old English wigs, and a long black robe, and Sylvia arrives for dinner. And in fact, Manfred Halberstadt says, come in, this is the way Jews dress. And they're busy having the dinner, and halfway through the dinner, he says, Sylvia, I'm actually just messing with you. I just thought I'd play a joke on you. But that created a bond between the Halberstadts to such an extent that she would, no matter where she was in the world, and John, I don't know if you know this at all, Sylvia would send postcards back to Graaff-Reinet from wherever she was in the world. And in fact, they would always arrive with Israeli stamps on them. And after she completed an operation, no matter where she was in the world. She was always instructed to lie low for a few months, and she would return through to Graaff-Reinet and just arrive in Graaff-Reinet for a few months, not doing anything. And Mrs. Halberstadt, Melanie's mother, would say, how on earth does she afford this lifestyle? She's traveling around the world. She keeps on arriving. She's not working for months at a time. And in fact, Mrs. Halberstadt says to her daughter, Melanie, I bet she's a Mossad spy. And no one, in fact, believes Mrs. Halberstadt at all.
Oh, well, it's just as well. But if I could just say something regarding that, and you're quite right. She sort of, in a sense, was imbued with Jewishness through this relationship. One of the sad things when we were filming, we went to visit Bunty's elder brother's grave in a Dutch Reform cemetery, or the large Graaff-Reinet cemetery. And my co-producer, Marilyn Marcus, located the Jewish cemetery, which abuts the Graaff-Reinet bowling club. And we went there, and it's immaculately kept. And it was very moving to see Bunty realize for the first time that his grandparents were buried there. But you mentioned shul. Across the wall from the cemetery is the shul, which is a tiny little place, which is currently a pigeon carriers club, which I thought was rather poetic in terms of spying and so on. But a very nicely well kept building. But that was, for me, one of the most moving parts of the film is Bunty realizing that he had enough DNA to be sent on a train to an oven. And from a personal point of view, it echoed with my own life, having a maternal grandfather that's Jewish and the maternal grandfather of my children is Jewish. Suddenly it dawned on me, I could have been on that train. But I will say this, Graaff-Reinet, even in its current form, do look after that cemetery. It was immaculately kept. The taps were missing off the sink, but you're quite right. She learnt Hebrew and learnt a great deal. But I will say this, she never converted. And when, at the end of her career, the chief rabbi of Israel, and we've got a letter to prove it, wrote her a letter saying, I'll give you a conversion in a day. She said, if you don't think I'm Jewish by now, a day's conversion isn't going to make a difference. So she never, ever converted to becoming Jewish. And that may have been because she believed she was.
So Lynette, at some point in time, in fact, Sylvia makes the decision she's going to leave South Africa. Talk us through that process.
Well, that was, as I said earlier, she definitely wanted to look for her roots. And so I think the first place that but she'd worked in London and she did all sorts of things. She was the most adventurous person I think I've ever known in my whole life. She was up for anything and she went everywhere and she tried every job she could think of doing because she spoke something like 6 or 8 languages: French, English, German, Hebrew, Norwegian, which she learned while she was in jail. She became fluent in Norwegian. So she was so, she had so much space for stuff in her head. That's the only way I can describe it. And,
was she very bright?
Very bright. She was very bright. Yeah, very bright indeed. But not only in academics, which she was, but just everything she touched, she went for 100%. And I think her main out-of-country thing was looking for her roots, because she identified with her father more than anybody certainly there were 5 children in the family, and she was definitely the only one who actually physically resembled her father.
So let's watch a little insert about her leaving South Africa and her recruitment into the Mossad.
Okay.
To escape the austerity of life on the kibbutz, a girlfriend suggested they spend a weekend in Tel Aviv, where they could meet up with friends to drink and dance. One of these friends worked for an obscure organization called Unit 188. Sylvia was of professional interest to him. He asked the recruitment officer of Unit 188 to meet her for coffee. His colleague immediately found what they were looking for: a non-Jew, but one that could speak Hebrew, French, had taught herself Arabic, and was forthright about Israel's right to exist.
I am the one that should be blamed for bringing Sylvia to the Mossad ranks. After a few discreet meetings, I got the impression that Sylvia is a potential candidate. She underwent a series of tests, and the recommendation was to put her through training period.
They trained her as a combatant, getting her to infiltrate perceived enemy territory, then leaving her to find her way back alone to safety. It was apparent she wanted adventure, yet had a sharply honed instinct for survival. Unit 188, now known as the Mossad, sent her to Canada, to Vancouver. Here she became Patricia Roxburgh. As Patricia, she learned to speak French with a Canadian accent and found work freelancing for the Vancouver Sun. Patricia was sent to Paris, the center of Mossad's operations in Europe.
There was something fascinating and compelling about her, actually. She was very, very beautiful and very, very much strongly her own woman. I mean, there was always something a little bit distant, mysterious about her. She would say, "John, I'm off to the Middle East on an assignment," and reappear a few weeks later. Her intentions were not entirely, how would one say, straightforward. There was something else behind it.
So, in fact, Lynette, she goes to Canada. She's a photographer. She gets to meet some fabulous people. But at some point in time, she actually tells you she's a spy.
Yeah.
How did that happen, and how did you take it?
Well, she came to see me in Franschhoek. No, I'm wrong. She told me when we were still living in Johannesburg. And she just brought it up sort of nonchalantly and said that, you know, I'm actually a spy. And my name is Patricia Roxburgh. And I'm actually living in Canada, even though you think I'm sitting in Israel. And I must admit, my immediate instinct was that she's playing a role. You know, she's talking nonsense, she's playing a role, because she loved acting and she loved, you know, that kind of stuff. And it took her a little while to persuade me that she was genuine and that it was the truth. But she made me swear on my grave that, or somebody's grave, that I would never tell anybody. And I never even told my husband, because she was always terrified of reciprocations from the other side. So obviously I never spoke about it, and which meant that when she eventually got arrested in Lillehammer, I wasn't as shocked as I would have been had I not known about that in the first place. Yeah.
So Dave, what do we know about Mossad recruitment of people in Israel? Is that a common thing? Is this a unique experience?
It's not unique. I mean, I must say, a lot of us go through that same experience. If you English speaking and you immigrate to Israel, and you're at an absorption center, many of us are called, and it is quite interesting that in the movie, which Sackstein has over there at the place in Rehov Allenby, where she was recruited, I'm familiar with that place because, like many of us, we were called to go there and be interviewed. So it's not uncommon for the Mossad to zoom in on people that have immigrated or have come to Israel and see whether they have the credentials, the talents, the expertise, whatever, that they can use. And that's how it happens. Now, it's clear that Sylvia, when she arrived, she went to a kibbutz called Gan Shmuel, which is just north of Hadera. And it's quite interesting because you say whether she spoke Hebrew or didn't speak Hebrew, but it's not clear that she learned Hebrew in Graaff-Reinet, because certain people from the kibbutz that were interviewed afterwards, in hindsight, have remarked that when she was on the kibbutz, she pretended not to know Hebrew. And they realized afterwards that she was understanding the instructions that were given to her, but nevertheless pretended that she didn't understand. So she was obviously quite brilliant at subterfuge and playing various roles and pretending to be whatever she needed or wanted to pretend.
Exactly.
So, I mean, she was, as her husband said, the consummate professional.
So,
But
John,
yeah.
Sorry, Dave. I wanted to bring in John Swain now because, John, you told us you met her at a party, she seduced you, you became lovers, you're living in Paris. Tell us what Europe was like at that time. At that point in time, almost the PLO has moved some of its war. They've been expelled from Jordan. They've moved some of their war into Europe. Their planes being hijacked, their terrorist attacks taking place in Europe. It's that background that Sylvia now moves from Canada to Paris, meets you, moves in with you.
Well, yes, I think that Paris was became the Mossad hub, but also it was incredibly important for the PLO operations, and that there were sympathizers in Paris. Obviously, there are a lot of Arabs in France. There'd been the Algerian War. And it was a very important center. I mean, I was working as a journalist on France Press. I wasn't involved in. I was working as actually on the English desk, so I was not doing a full-time sort of journalist job of traveling around. Although I was also working as a freelance for a British newspaper, which I think attracted Sylvia because I was quite adventurous and wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and went off to Africa and to Chad, which I can talk about a bit later. But it was something which Sylvia noted. But there was no. I mean, she talked to me about the Middle East, and I think, you know, and I remember her, but in a sort of general way, and saying how fond she was of the Arabs and all those things. I mean, and so there's no hint that she was on one side of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which had been. I mean, in '68, of course, there'd been the Six-Day War. That's when I first moved to Paris, and so there's the whole sort of aftermath of that. But of course, France was also bogged down at the time, obviously with the student uprising and this, that, and the other. And talking to subsequently French intelligence officer who became a very high-powered French intelligence officer, long retired now, he said that the French didn't actually put, at that time, didn't have the financial resources to watch potential Arab terrorist operations in France. They were busy with other things. Obviously, it was the Cold War. Subsequently, when the assassinations took place after the Munich, when Mossad had these revenge assassinations in Europe of Black September people and associates, it was Mossad who actually found one of them, who the French had been looking for quite a while.
Now, John, at some point in time, Sylvia says to you, Muammar Gaddafi has just, in fact, taken power in a coup in Libya. Let's go be the first Westerners to go meet him. What happened?
Well, that's absolutely true. I think she wanted, I was very keen to go, and she wanted to piggyback with me on this operation to get an interview with Gaddafi. This wasn't for Agence France Presse, but on my sort of freelance journalism, which I was working for a British newspaper, as well as being full-time for Agence France Presse. So, and she was very, very determined about us applying for a visa. And if I got the visa, I put her down as my photographer and would be able to go. Sadly, it didn't happen. Sadly, I say, because it would have been a terrific story. And Sylvia was obviously disappointed, but I was going to be her entree into going to Tripoli, getting an interview with the young and seemingly rather glamorous Colonel Gaddafi, a young, very handsome man who just overthrown the king and taken power. It would have been a terrific story, but for Sylvia, it would have been much more than that. It would have been a chance to get a look at his security, I guess, find out how he operated, and lay the foundations for a Mossad espionage operation on him in Libya.
So now, John, when Sylvia would say to you, I'm just hopping off to the Middle East, I'll be back in a few days, and she'd come back a few weeks later, where did you think she was? And did she ever tell you what countries she had been in?
Well, she said, yes, she had been in Lebanon. I don't think it really got much further than that, as I remember. She was very, very discreet. And as I said, there was an age difference between us. So I was younger and a little bit infatuated with her in the sense that I just learned not to ask too many questions. I was very happy as things were. So I can't really shed any light on that, but you know, she was away quite a lot, and quite suddenly would just sort of vanish. So as I said, in a way, you know, our relationship was I would say on and off, but it was unreliable because she just go. And of course, as a journalist, I respected that, and you know, that's what one does. But she always had a sort of an explanation for it, yeah?
So let's actually look at some of the operational details that we know about, and we're going to come back and talk about some of those things in a few minutes' time.
אני יכול לומר בקלות רבה מאוד אחריות רבה מאוד, שהיא הייתה מהלוחמות היותר מוצלחות של המוסד, השתתפה במבצעים רבים.
She joined a well-connected photographic agency, the Dalma Agency, known for its sympathetic views of the Palestinian plight. Sylvia's first victim in Paris was Mahmoud al-Hamshari, the PLO's representative in France. This is a car bombing the French believe they can firmly pin on Sylvia. Mohamed Boudir, an Algerian, climbed into his Renault 16 car. He had hardly sat down when the car exploded. Patricia passed herself off as an ardent supporter of the Arab cause and got easy access to the most difficult places: Cairo, Mogadishu in Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Beirut, and most dangerous of all, Damascus in Syria.
There was a Syrian episode, and that scared the hell out of me because that's one country you don't want to be caught in.
Eli Cohen, the revered Mossad spy, was so convincing He was appointed by the Syrian regime as chief advisor to Syria's Minister of Defense. His purpose uncovered, he was publicly hung. The Mossad played an ace hand. Sylvia was sent to Damascus as his replacement. The Syrians would never suspect a woman would be up for this kind of assignment.
And who's she with there?
Bedouin family, yes.
She assimilates rapidly into
Any culture. Yes, that's Sylvia and the Queen. Yeah, Hussein's wife. Well, he's dead now, the older Hussein.
King Hussein.
Jordan. Yes, yes.
But what was she doing there?
Babysitting. They asked her to babysit the kids.
She was walking amongst the most dangerous people in the world in the late 60s and 70s. If she had to pull this off and not lose her life, she had to fool the best, and she did.
So let's in fact bring in David and Saxon here. What do we know about Sylvia's operations?
Well, go ahead, David, if you...
No, I'm not sure we know very much. And there's a lot of supposition over here. We do know that she babysat the present king of Jordan, and therefore she had this incredible ability to get into the inner sanctums of the Arab world, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in Syria. And we do believe that after the hanging of Eli Cohen, she took over. This is part of supposition, but this is what we think we believe. And one wonders why, but the thinking at the time was that the Syrians would never suspect a woman to be sent in as an agent of Israel into such a dangerous place. But she had this incredible ability, like a chameleon, to blend into any community. She was quite amazing. I must say I'm a little surprised, because being the consummate professional, to hear that she actually revealed, even though it's to a good friend, which I only heard tonight, that she was a spy. I find that that's strange that she would actually reveal that, but maybe she felt safe with a friend from Graaff-Reinet to reveal that. Because even if one listens to what Aeneas, her husband, said, she never revealed anything. Now, this is to her husband and to a lawyer of what transpired before the Norwegian business. So, you want to continue?
I mean, largely what you say is right. I think that, you've got to follow the chronology here. Not you, David, one has to follow the chronology. She was nanny to now the current king of Jordan at the time that Arafat and the Palestinians, the PLO, were attempting to take over Jordan. And she was conveniently signed up by the royal family. I have a suspicion, and as you say, a lot of it has to be supposition. I have a suspicion that the late King Hussein knew that she was a Jewish agent, combatant, and knew that she would reliably report back to Israel what was going on in his country, because he had all his generals forming up against him. And literally they said, we might as well hang women's pants instead of our flag, the way Arafat is taking over everything. And this is where, if you want, Sylvia's bête noire, or her target, came into high focus. Salameh, who was without doubt going to be Arafat's successor. He was Arafat's protege. And the actual civil war that took place in Jordan between the Jordanians and the PLO was entitled Black September, because basically 50,000 Palestinians were killed by the Jordanians. The rest escaped to Lebanon, with Ali Salameh as the sort of principal leader. In actual fact, what led to Lillehammer was, I think, planted information that he had gone to meet a financier or the bagman for the PLO in Lillehammer. And that's what led to the disastrous assassination of the wrong man. But
we will come on to the
yes,
story
no,
of Lillehammer.
Because I also want to add to that story. Yeah.
Yeah, we will come on to Lillehammer as a complete story.
But
if
I could just add one more thing. What is really extraordinary, and I'm sure David will agree, is that without doubt, she was within Arafat's inner circle, and presenting herself as a photographer, somebody who could give the PLO world publicity through her photographs of their, degraded lives and so on, but all the time working for Mossad. Anyway, I will.
One of the things, sorry, Dave, just before we come to you, yes, we'll come to you in a second. One of the things that she told one of her friends in Israel afterwards was that she knew Arafat well. He was not much to speak of, and he was actually quite disgusting.
Well, I don't know all that, but she knew him very well. And in actual fact, he thought that she was working for him.
If I can just add, Howard.
Yes, sure.
The superlative spy that she was. In 2015, I had the opportunity to interview Eitan Harber, and you just had a clip of him. In the last clip section you began with him. And I was interviewing Eitan Harber because, as I said earlier, he was a great friend and confidant of Yitzhak Rabin, and it was the 20th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 2015. So I interviewed him on that story. We were sitting in the Hilton, the Tel Aviv Hilton, in the executive lounge, and we completed the interview, which went on for about an hour and a half, and I thought I'll just try. And I said to him, just off the record, Eitan, we finished the interview. Can we just talk about Sylvia Raphael? And he gave me a smile, like a Walter Matthau expression, as if this is not something he wanted to go into. So I said to him, I said, Eitan, you said, and there was a clip now, you said that Sylvia Raphael was one of the best Mossad agents. How come? Can you tell me anything? So he says, I'm going to tell you two things. One, she was not one of the best, she was the best. And two, I'm going to tell you nothing more. And that summed it up for me. And that's why we have such tremendous difficulties in getting information. All the time we're obstructed. And just to give you an example of why all these years later, it's still a hot issue. When I wanted to hold a memorial service at the kibbutz, which he was buried last year, the kibbutz was phoned by the security services. Why are you holding a ceremony for her? Who's coming? And I then get a call from the Jerusalem Post. They say, there's a man here has left his phone number. He's looking for you. So I made some investigation, and I saw it was one of her handlers. So I just dropped it. So even to this day, there was so much that she was involved in, really getting into those inner sanctums that people in the intelligence community still do not want revealed. And there's a reason, if you go to the museum in Gilot for the Mossad and you open the drawers of all these talented spies and you find reams of information in all these drawers, and you open Sylvia's, and there's only one page and it's written by her husband. Sylvia's life, even after all these years, is still in the shadows.
So, David, I don't know if you've read this book at all. This is Ronen Bergman, and it's Rise Up and Kill. And I want to maybe just read a paragraph out of the book. And he says, on 8th October, Mossad director Amit met with Prime Minister and Defense Minister Levi Eshkol to submit a plan for his approval. We have 3 targets, he says. They are in Beirut and Damascus, and we want to execute. After identifying the targets, they decide, in fact, to send them gifts, as they call it, via post. And they say, it will be a woman doing it this time. She'll go to Beirut and slip the letters into a mailbox there. She is South African with a British passport, and she's ready to do it. Amit was speaking about Sylvia Raphael, the daughter of a Jewish father and a Gentile mother, who had developed a strong allegiance with the Jewish people, integrated to Israel and recruited by the Mossad. She was trained by Moti Kfir and became the most famous female operative in the history of Caesarea.
There you are.
So maybe, John, I don't know if you, in that clip, you saw pictures of Sylvia with some very interesting people. You saw pictures of Sylvia with Jimmy Carter and with Jerry Lewis and with Yul Brynner. How on earth did she mix in those circles?
Well, that's a good question, but I think she certainly is part as her role with Agence Delmas. Obviously, she wanted to travel around the Middle East as much as possible, posing as a photographer and infiltrating the top echelons of the PLO. But also she went to Cannes, and some of those pictures might have come from there. She took pictures of stars.
Okay, and Saxon, we know, for example, that she was in places like Mogadishu and Eritrea. Do we have any idea what she was doing there?
I have absolutely no idea what she was doing there, other than the fact that obviously Mogadishu was a key place. It was where the airplanes were blown up, if you'll recall those images. And Eritrea, I can only assume that it was a sort of armory conduit for the PLO. I don't know is the honest answer to that. What I do know, following on from what John was saying, is that a large part of her cover was she was a photographer and she learnt, or put it this way, polished her skills as a photographer by being a stills cameraman or camera woman, forgive me, camera woman on movie sets. And that is how she is photographed with the likes of Jerry Lewis and also, you know, it looks as though Aeneas is introducing Sylvia to Jimmy Carter. You know, I can only assume, yeah, I can only assume that it was Aeneas's contact, Jimmy Carter. Aeneas is interesting because he was not the original defense lawyer. That's why she got a life sentence.
Let's get on to that when we come to that part of the story.
Oh my goodness, all the best.
So it's September 1970. The PLO tried to take over Jordan as a country.
Yeah.
Sylvia is in fact part of the PLO inner circle at this point in time, but she clearly has very good relationships with King Hussein and his family. And in fact,
King Hussein, yeah.
There are reports that, in fact, during the PLO attempt to overthrow King Hussein and take over the country, in fact, King Hussein and his family get flown out by the Israelis to safety in Israel as they try to, in fact, put down the PLO uprising in the country. The PLO loses it, gets expelled from Jordan, and goes, in fact, to Lebanon. And Sylvia moves with the PLO out of Jordan into Lebanon itself. And the PLO make a decision. They're going to take their war and they're going to move it into Europe. And one of the most famous things they did was an operation during the Munich Olympic Games. And let's in fact have a look at that clip right now.
Ali Hassan Salameh, nicknamed the Red Prince, was regarded by Yasser Arafat as his protege. He helped form an elite group called Black September, a tribute to the month the Palestinians were brutally expelled from Jordan to the Lebanon. Among the many terrorist outrages of plane hijackings and killings, he masterminded Black September's murderous kidnapping of 11 Israeli athletes during the Munich Olympics of 1972.
A masked gunman steps onto the balcony of 31 Connolly Street in Munich's Olympic Village. Inside, 2 Israeli athletes are dead. Another 9 Israelis held hostage by a group of Palestinian gunmen calling themselves Black September.
In the weeks following Munich, Golda Meir's advisors on terrorism gathered to devise another plan for revenge: targeted assassinations. Operation Wrath of God would be the instrument of its revenge. We will smite them wherever they may be.
It is here in Oslo Sylvia stood trial accused of Norway's most serious crime, planned murder. There is no doubt she was the senior combatant within the unit led by Mike Harari, sent to kill the mastermind behind the Munich Olympic massacre of Israeli athletes.
The people in charge of the operation, including Tzvi Zamir, the head of the Mossad, because they were so anxious to kill Ali Hassan Salameh, they said, no, you are wrong, we are right, and they gave the orders, and the assassination team moved in.
At 10:35 p.m., the agents fired 14 shots at close range. The man they left dying by the side of the road was not Ali Hassan Salameh. It was Ahmed Bouchiki, a Moroccan waiter who lived in this modest apartment building, rode his bicycle to work, and was killed coming home from a movie with his pregnant wife, Turil.
And it led to the discovery of several Israeli safe houses across Europe. And really it led to massive international embarrassment for Israel as a whole.
The members of the team, including Sylvia, were apprehended, tried and sentenced for 5 years. Released after 2.5 years, Sylvia married her Norwegian lawyer.
Sylvia thought it failed on professionalism. She was so broken-hearted, really, about all the mistakes that she thought the Mossad had made.
And it was one of the biggest failures of Mossad. They were arrogant. They thought Norwegians, sleepy, and the blame seems to be solely on Mike Harari.
So in fact, what happens? Golda Meir gives the instructions. They will avenge the death of the 11 athletes that were murdered by Black September at the Munich Olympics. And hit squads, in fact, go out throughout Europe looking for all of those involved. And in fact, John, many of these things start in Paris. I don't know if you and Sylvia were still together at that point in time or had any contact, but one of the first people who was assassinated was, in fact, the head of the PLO in France. His name was Mahmoud Hamshari. And for many people who've seen the movie Munich, the story is, in fact, he gets a call from someone posing as an Italian journalist, a woman. They believe it is, in fact, Sylvia. She lures him out of his apartment. While he's out, the Mossad go into his apartment and plant a bomb under his desk. He returns home. Sylvia calls him. When he's identified himself, the bomb goes off, and the head of the PLO in Paris is, in fact, dead. He, in fact, doesn't die immediately. He dies only the next day. He gets rushed to hospital. And while in hospital, the police interview him. And he tells the story of a woman journalist who took him out and then called him to make sure it was him before the bomb, in fact, goes off. That's, in fact, one of the first assassinations that take place by the Mossad after the Munich Olympics. Saxon, there were others as well. There were a number of people killed in Paris. There were people killed in Rome.
Mm-hmm. Yep. In fact, until Sylvia died, there was still an extradition warrant for Sylvia to be returned to Italy to face charges for the killing of senior PLO operative in Rome. You know, it's sort of, you know, as John's sort of described, it's very hard to sort of get across how threatening the European PLO cells were to Israel and to Jews. And, you know, the whole Munich massacre was sort of kind of the icing on the cake for the PLO. It was an absolutely horrific crime. And, you know, I don't think the Olympic Committee comes out with too many accolades for the way they handled it. But having said that, you're right. The one thing that Israel is renowned for is they never give up. And even though Sylvia never got to see Ali Hassan Salameh eventually taken care of, Mossad continued to persist until they eventually got him. As I was saying, and I hope I'm not over reiterating the point, I feel that Lillehammer was Salameh's way of using his limited resources to set Mossad up, to give them a very good reason to go to Lillehammer. The poor man that was killed was equally set up to be the target. Sylvia had grave reservations about the target. One, she knew that Salameh never could not speak French, and yet this poor man spoke fluent French. He was Algerian or Moroccan. I'm sorry, I can't recall. But he certainly spoke French. And Sylvia knew that the Red Prince, the man that she was after, couldn't speak a word of it.
So Saxon, let's actually swap over to David at this point in time. Yeah. David, tell us the story of Lillehammer.
One of the things I just want to add credence to what Saxon is saying, in that his case that he's making, that Salameh engineered this to bring disrepute to the Mossad, is that a week or two after the funeral, I went to the kibbutz here in Israel, and I interviewed Sylvia's best friend on the kibbutz Ramat HaKodesh. Her name is Zahab. And she told me that when Sylvia last came to Israel, which was shortly before she died, she knew she was dying of leukemia, and she wanted to come and come to Israel and speak to her friends. And one of the things she asked, that when she did die, that she would be buried in Israel on the kibbutz. But at that meeting of her friend asked her the question, and it was a strange question. She asked Sylvia, how does it feel to have been responsible for the killing of an innocent person, referring to the waiter in Lillehammer? And Sylvia's reply was, who says he was innocent? And she said no more.
So David, tell us the story of Lillehammer. The Mossad gets a tip-off that the mastermind of Black September, Ali Salameh, is in fact hiding in Lillehammer, and there is in fact a courier going to meet him. They follow the courier.
Right, and who do they meet? They meet Ahmad Bouchiki. Now, Ahmad Bouchiki, some of you might know, is the brother of Chico Bouchiki, who is the co-founder of the famous band, the Gypsy Kings. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the music of the Gypsy Kings. This was the guy that they killed, who at the time was a waiter in Lillehammer. And at a swimming pool, that's where he met the person that was sent by Black September. And as Saxon was telling you, they assumed that this person was Salome, and he was shot, and you saw that clip at the bus stop, unfortunately, in front of his pregnant wife. It was horrendous, was terrible. But the remark afterwards by Salome, oh, how stupid the Mossad is. They killed an innocent waiter. So
in fact, they say that they killed the pool attendant.
This was all engineered.
Yeah.
So in fact, Saxon, tell us what Salome heard when in fact the assassination takes place.
Well, he was obviously nowhere near Norway, and when he found out that Ahmed Bouchiki had been shot, he laughed and said to think they killed a pool attendant, because he had two jobs. He was a waiter and a pool attendant at the same time.
That's right.
And I think that there was a degree of hubris on the part of Mossad in this operation. Mike Harari, it transpires, turned out to be a rather dubious character. He went on to become Noriega's security advisor in Panama. After, I think he was sacked actually as a result of Lillehammer. He told Sylvia to action the killing based on the fact that Ahmed Bouchiki took his blonde wife into a cinema, and he said to Sylvia, kill this man. It is definitely Salome. Salome has a thing for blondes. And that was the pretext. And I'll tell you another thing, that Sylvia was the only person to try and protect the rest of her team. Mike Harari, literally having given the order, left Norway for Israel almost immediately, expecting to read wonderful headlines in the newspapers the next day, and left them to their own fate. And unfortunately, for Mossad, they had got a fantastically professional commander in Sylvia, but she was supported by two naive new operatives, purely selected because they had a smattering of Scandinavian. And, you know, both under interrogation buckled immediately. Dan Arbel, who maintains that Sylvia was his lover, which is absolute rubbish. Dan Arbel could not bear being confined in a cell because he was claustrophobic. So he opened up immediately and told the Norwegian intelligence what they wanted to know. The other female operative equally caved in. And the interesting thing is that John alluded to it too. The head of French intelligence at the time, who John was talking about, actually went to Oslo to have his turn with Sylvia, interrogating her. And the phenomenal thing about Sylvia is no one bore any animus towards her. These two individuals who were head of their intelligence services were interrogating her under extreme circumstances. She was charming, she talked, she answered all their questions. And the funny thing is that when they read through the transcripts afterwards, she had told them nothing. And they admired her for that. They admired her courage and her tenacity and her robust approach to it. The fact she gave away nothing, but always remained civil and gracious throughout. And I just found that a common theme throughout the whole of my experience of Sylvia's story, because I met Chico via John. John's partner is in the music industry, and I was trying to get hold of Ahmed Bouchiki's family, but they had a NDA with the Israeli government and couldn't talk to me. And I was despairing because I wanted to ask that family how much Ahmed's death impacted on their lives. And John wonderfully mystically came up with the fact that he could introduce me to Chico Buchiki. And I thought I was going to meet somebody that would be extremely anti-Sylvia, quite the reverse, and anti-Israel, absolutely not. And the irony, and poetic irony, is that Shimon Peres requested the Gypsy Kings to play for him when he celebrated the receiving the Nobel Prize and the peace treaty in Oslo, of all things. And Chico goes probably every year to perform in Israel. So you just find that this woman beguiled so many people in such a winning way, and I find and the lovely culmination of all Lillehammer is that Sylvia longed for a permanent partner, but being a spy, you had to have a relationship that's based on trust, and being a spy, you couldn't have that relationship. And the strange thing is that once she had received a considerable sentence in Norway, her appellant advocate walked into her cell to take instruction, and it was love at first sight. And
before we get on to the happy ever after, but Dave, tell us, how did they get caught?
Sorry?
How did they get caught?
How did Sylvia get caught?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I don't know the exact details of that, but she was, as you heard, Mike Harari did a bunk and left the three of them, and yes, the three, and they were arrested.
Saxon, do you know the story of how she got caught?
Sadly, the two young uninducted operatives buckled very quickly.
How did they get caught?
They were caught because they didn't change their hire car and kept the one that they had been seen in. They were using walkie-talkies quite openly, and they were followed to the airport. And as soon as they tried to hand in their hire car, they were arrested. They buckled under interrogation, and they told the security agencies of Norway where they could find Sylvia. And Sylvia had found safe haven with the consul the Israeli consul in Oslo, but she felt rather than cause an international incident, particularly with a country who at that time was very pro-Israel, she didn't want to cause an international incident. So she left the safety of the consul and allowed herself to be arrested. But she gave absolutely nothing away. And that I have on record, on interview, by both the head of French intelligence and the head of Norwegian intelligence. And both thought she was the most remarkable woman. And I guess probably wished that she was working for them rather than the Israelis.
So John, when this hits the headlines, is that the first time you realized that your former lover was in fact a spy?
Yes, of course, it certainly was. By that time, I was in Indochina. I was in Vietnam at the time. Of course, I remember I was in Vietnam from 70 to Vietnam and Cambodia from 1970 to 1975. So I was not in Europe at the time of the Munich massacre. Obviously, I had followed it in great detail. And Sylvia and I were no longer in touch, as happens. And in 1973, I was at the Reuters office in Saigon going through the Reuters World News on their WA service, and up flashed a bulletin, as the Reuters would call it, urgent, saying an assassination has happened in Lillehammer, and the Norwegian police suspect it's an act of state terrorism, etc., etc. And it gradually throughout the day or the hours, it evolved that they had arrested a number of the people suspected to belong to Mossad. I obviously read it as a journalist out of interest, and out popped the name. One of the arrested people is a Canadian called Patricia Roxburgh, and I thought, blow me, how could that possibly be true? I was absolutely flabbergasted, and I remember talking to the colleagues in the writer's office at the time, saying, "You can't imagine what I just read." I knew this woman, and we were lovers, and she's actually was a Mossad spy, part of a Mossad hit team. It's alleged.
So, Derek, when did your family first realize, or was this the first time your family actually realized who your aunt was?
Yeah, I think the whole of South Africa sort of got to know about Sylvia after Lillehammer. I remember those headlines, this beautiful South African spy arrested, and of course became the Oslo spy trial, and we followed that. So that's the first time really that we knew where Sylvia was and what had happened. And we heard about the sentence she'd got, which was 5.5 years, but she only served like 18 months of that sentence. And one thing she did talk about to us was that it was, how can I put it? She was treated very well while she was in that prison, that she used to go shopping occasionally with the guards. So there was a lot of sympathy for the cause. So for my brother and myself, and my brother's 8 years older, and we would say, I wonder where Aunt Sylvia is, you know, what's happened to Aunt Sylvia? And then in about, well, it was about probably 1998 or so, she'd been back in Pretoria for some time. And, you know, when did we get cell phones? About 94.
94,
so
yeah.
I was probably, so I was probably on a Bosch cell phone with a long aerial. And we should just always just joke in a way about Aunt Syl. And then I got this call, and hello, Derek. Yes, this is your Aunt Sylvia. So you can imagine, I sort of froze, and I said, yes. She said, you know, I was a spy for the Mossad, and I'm now living in Pretoria, and would like to meet you and your family. And of course, tell my wife, you know, Sylvia's called me. She wants us to go for dinner. And I know she was very
Derek,
nervous
you're going to tell us that story in a few minutes. I want to just get the reaction of Lynette. So you, in fact, at that point in time, you had known for years that Sylvia was a spy, but now it's hit the headlines in South Africa. What did you think? What did you feel? Did you tell people that you had known all along who Sylvia actually was?
I must be honest that I don't really remember what I did at the time. Obviously, I told my husband then that I had known. But obviously, we were all very worried that she was going to sit in jail for 5 years. And before that, one was worried that she might get a much larger sentence than that.
So
but then we all did watch a lot of the trial, and I think that's a story that comes a little bit later.
So we'll come to that in a second.
Yeah.
But
Howard,
of course,
Howard, but I just some of the points that's been raised, and about her personality and character, I think it's very revealing that she was so revered in Norway. And I'm just looking at this newspaper cutting, speaking about the time that she was incarcerated in Norway, and what Derek was saying, that she went shopping, and this newspaper cutting says she was, this is now from where she was in her cell, she was taken into Oslo in a family car. A plainclothes policeman shadowed her as she browsed around the cosmetic counters of the big stores and looked at the latest fashions. Nobody recognized her. Now just think about it. Here's somebody who's been convicted of murder or assassination, and she's allowed to go out freely, observed from a distance by a policeman as she went to cosmetic counters shopping. That tells you something about the character and personality. And this particular article ends off saying, Miss Raphael has become something of a national figure. her sophistication, calm, eloquence, allied to the idealism which led her to become a now self-confessed Israeli anti-terrorist agent, have made her extremely popular in Norway. I think that's quite fascinating.
But there was a nice little quip as well. I don't know if you heard that one when she was sentenced to 5.5 years on appeal, I think it was. She said, yeah, I was the much vaunted 007, but now I've just been reduced to 005.5, which I think was a bit of her humor coming out.
We're going to talk a little more about her trial and in fact her incarceration in a one minute. But of course, Steven Spielberg. No, you're going to wait, Saxon, because Steven, because Steven Spielberg in fact took the story of the Munich massacre and he in fact immortalized it in a movie called Munich. And we're just going to look at a few of the clips from that, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Where you have a filmmaker like Steven Spielberg making the film Munich, which involves Sylvia. As a character, though, is played by Daniel Craig, the current James Bond.
I don't think Sylvia's part was known by Spielberg. He based it on the book, and that's the only reference he had.
Even as part of an ensemble cast, Craig managed to stand out as Steve, a South African driver turned assassin whose vocal desire for vengeance in the name of the Jewish people was a sight to behold.
Because the only blood that matters to me is Jewish blood.
As far as political thrillers go, Munich is certainly one of the most poignant, and Craig had a hand in making that happen.
Look at the waistline bulge on that guy. Look at that. I think he might be armed, eh?
Now, Saxon, now you can tell us your story.
No. It was just a follow-on from Dave's recitation of her period in prison. Bunty and I, while we were filming, we were not allowed to film. We couldn't get official permission to film in the prison. So we decided to literally barge our way in. And sitting at a desk, a reception desk, again, mystically, was her jailer. He had retired from the prison service, but he looked after her in jail. And I just liked his anecdote to Bunty. He said, I just wish I'd played my cards better with your sister, because I'm sure there was something between us.
So in fact, Melanie book tells me a story that, of course, from the kibbutz, they used to send her things for Rosh Hashanah and for Pesach. And she, even though she was an atheist, even though she wasn't Jewish, she would make sure that for Pesach, they in fact kashered her cell for Passover. She would get all the guards to help her and in fact would kasher the place, and then she would take the guards shopping to go get new crockery and cutlery and things for Passover so she could have a kosher for Passover cell in the thing. But in fact, Lynette, you went to go visit her in jail, did you not?
We did. My husband and I went, and it was a surreal experience, absolutely. We were welcomed by the lady warder, who took us into her sitting room, and there was Sylvia, relaxed and enjoying herself, reading a book, and then in came the salmon, smoked salmon sandwiches and the Earl Grey tea. And we all had a lovely visit, and apparently she spent most of her time in the sitting room with the lady warden, and they had become best buddies. So I don't think that it was all hard slog for her while she was in jail, but she did do a lot of studying. She learned to speak Norwegian fluently while she was there, and did lots of other studying and stuff like that. So she spent her 18 months very well.
So Derek, I don't know if you know who this is, but there's a message from someone called Denzel Feinberg in Ottawa, Canada. He says, I am the half-nephew on Sylvia, whose father, Ferdy, was my grandpa. I met Sylvia in 1997 in Pretoria.
That's right. And I think we went on a trip together, if I remember, with Denzel once, because we must have met Sylvia about, late 90s. And Denzel is also part of my family that is, how can I put it? We've got a wide spread of religions in our family. Let's put it that way. From Mormons to my sister, who's a Messianic Jew, to my brother-in-law, who has become Jewish, and they live in New Zealand, but he Skypes, to get lessons every week. There's a cross section across our family.
So, Saxon, you were telling us earlier that, in fact, Sylvia, tell us about Aeneas. She marries Aeneas. Aeneas is, in fact, one of her defense attorneys. Tell us about him. They get married. You, in fact, go off to meet him together with Bunty.
Yeah. And what a wonderful gentleman he was. Aeneas, to give you some kind of comparative idea, was the Harry Nell of Norwegian, the Norwegian legal world. He was highly thought of. He was highly connected, and he was her appellant advocate. He handled her appeal. And the head of intelligence for Norway said he knew he was stuffed the moment Aeneas pitched up in court, that they would not be able to detain Sylvia for very long. And Aeneas was married at the time with children. And as I say, Sylvia's, if Sylvia had a sadness in her life, it was the fact that she really didn't have a permanent partner. And basically he walked in to take her instruction, and inexplicably they fell in love with each other. And I'm glad that they did, because he brought her great happiness and stability. He also had her sentence significantly reduced, and they married. And part of the condition with the sentence being reduced is that Sylvia had to leave Norway immediately and never return. Unfortunately, she married Aeneas, which allowed her to return anytime she wanted, because she was a Norwegian citizen.
So in fact, she gets married in Pretoria.
She gets married in Pretoria.
They go back to live in Israel for a little while. Aeneas,
they visit Norway, and they loved Israel, and he loved the kibbutz, Ramat HaKadesh. And they worked on the kibbutz. They weren't on holiday at all. And I don't know, he just loved her, and was, they did try, obviously the PLO thought that they had murdered Sylvia in an outrage when they blew up a yacht.
So in fact, there's a few attempts. So first in 1977, they're living in Norway, and a PLO hit squad goes after Sylvia. They miss.
Right. But this was on a voyage in...
in 1979. It was just off the coast of Larnaca.
That's exactly it.
There was a yacht with 3 Mossad operatives.
And they start celebrating the next day. They celebrate the fact they've killed Sylvia.
In fact, Bunty gets a call to say, we're terribly sorry, but your sister's been killed. And he calls her. She's actually on holiday in Vietnam at the time.
That's right.
And she answers the telephone.
Anyway, the upshot
and
of it...
sorry, just one more. 1985, the PLO actually announced that they've killed her as well. But of course, she at that point in time is still very much alive.
Or wishful thinking on the PLO's part. I think that, to be frank, I think Mossad, you never fully retire from Mossad, but she did actually hand in her badge. But they don't stop looking after you and looking out for you. And I'm quite sure that they kept an eye on her while she was in Pretoria.
So in fact, let's actually ask Lynette, because Lynette, she moves back to South Africa. Do you renew your friendship?
Oh, absolutely we did, yes. But there are a few things there that are not 100% correct. For instance, Anais didn't fall in love with her at first sight. He fell in love with her during the course of the trial, where she kept the entire court in stitches of laughter the whole time instead of taking it seriously. And he fell in love with her wit and her the way she handled herself. He just couldn't get over. I mean, he was a very staid, wonderful guy, but, you know, he lived a very staid life. And suddenly to have this vibrant, funny, outrageous woman actually fall in love with him, it was just too much. He was completely bowled over. But a little bit about Anais is that he was a fighter pilot for England during the Second World War.
Oh, yeah.
And got an MBE from the Queen as a result of his whatever he did for England. And so he was famous in his own right, in a way. And yeah, I think that sort of sums that up. And then when they were in Pretoria, we saw a lot of them, but we were in Franschhoek and they were in Pretoria. But we went skiing every year together. And that was a sport that Sylvia both hated and loved. She loved it because Anais loved it so desperately. She didn't quite like it as much, but it was
I remember she came for dinner once with her leg in a cast, so maybe she wasn't quite as good a skier as Anais.
Absolutely.
Anais carried on skiing till his, 80s, he was still skiing.
Yes, he was. And Sylvia wanted him to stop skiing
yeah.
when he turned 70. She insisted he had to stop skiing, but he never did.
So Derek, when she's called you, you were starting to tell us the story. Aunt Syl has now called you. She wants to meet you. What happens?
Well, I tell my wife that I told her before a little bit about Aunt Sylvia, but maybe not the full story. And I said what she wants is to go for dinner. So you can imagine there was a little bit of apprehension and a little bit of nervousness, but we went to a place in Pretoria, which, as I remember, it was open to the street, no big gates and not security that we could see. But, you know, from the moment we met Sylvia, she was just so warm and so companionable and, you know, had stories to tell, which obviously weren't related to the Mossad, but she was so welcoming. And Anais, what a dignified, wonderful man that, Belinda loved her. And that's how we started, visiting each other, and they'd come around here, we'd go there, not on a monthly basis, but we definitely kept in touch. And of course, when it was 2005, when she was really with the leukemia was really getting bad, that she passed on.
So Lynette, when she got ill, you remained in touch with her. She got leukemia. You used to have discussions about death. You had many of these deep, deep discussions about life. Tell us a little about that.
Well, when Sylvia was diagnosed, she didn't actually tell anybody what had happened. Even with the doctors, she just joked and treated it all as though it really wasn't happening. And certainly didn't tell me, or I don't think she told anybody, maybe Anais, that she had cancer, until eventually it got bad enough that it was definitely going to be terminal. And then she used to come and stay with me quite often, and we did. We had lots of talks about it, and in the end, she just kept on trying to stay alive and didn't want to accept the fact that she might actually die. And well, eventually, well, we had a big discussion, and I told her to just let go, let go. She's just suffering unnecessarily. And I don't know, eventually she did just let go.
We're going to look at our last insert now, and then we're going to come back for some Q&A and some final comments.
After her release from prison, Sylvia, newly married to her defense lawyer Aeneas Schott, returned to Israel, to her adoptive kibbutz Ramat HaKovesh.
Sylvia was one of our family. We loved her very much. Always when she came to Israel, we were the first to host her. A few weeks before her death, she came to visit us. She well aware about the situation, and she actually came to say goodbye.
At the Institute of Israeli Intelligence, euphemistically referred to as a museum, a special and comprehensively secretive room has been set aside. Here lie open books of homage to late Mossad agents. Her page is the only tribute that allows an outsider to annotate. Aeneas writes lovingly of her.
And she mentioned us her desire to be buried here, and we keep her memories every day.
But here we have somebody completely out the circle, not even Jewish, and yet took the cause as her own with such conviction and passion, gave everything of herself for it. Quite extraordinary.
Quite a story to tell on Women's Month, don't you think? The story of truly an absolutely remarkable individual, a remarkable woman. So we have a Q&A button at the bottom. We would love you to ask our panelists any questions that you think are appropriate. So please, if you have any questions, don't put them into the chat. Please put them into the Q&A button, and we'd love to maybe answer some of those questions for you. So one of the questions, Saxon, you in fact have made this documentary about Sylvia. We've had so many questions about the documentary. When we end this program, we'll in fact be playing the full trailer of your documentary. Tell us what it's called, where can people get hold of it, and why have we not seen it yet in South Africa?
I'm glad that you brought that up. Thank you very much, Howard. And this is no self-publicity. The film is called Sylvia Tracing Blood. One, I wanted to have a title that suggested a thriller-like trope or a spy thriller trope in Tracing Blood. But it's more about the DNA, the Derek Watts is here and Bunty and so on and so forth. Tracing your ancestry and connecting with that. The film has been shown everywhere, from Canada to China, even in Ghana and Zimbabwe, of all places. It's currently being streamed by the Sundance streaming service from Sundance Film Festival in the United States and Amazon Prime. Why it has not been shown in South Africa perplexes me. It has been offered to broadcasters here, but and I can only go anecdotally, the suggestion has been by the broadcasters that they know their audience and they wouldn't be interested in a film that celebrates a superheroine of Israel. I think that is what saddens me most, because I had a fantastic South African crew. The music by Helen Rautenbach is superb and has been acclaimed throughout the world. My editor was outstanding, South African editor. We worked here in Cape Town. And I think it's just lamentable that it's been passed over in South Africa. When even in China, China paid top dollar to buy the rights to show it in China. It just defies explanation as to why it's not being shown in South Africa. But this is the only country, as I speak, that it's not been screened in.
Wow. So we've had a number of questions come in. There's also a book written about Sylvia as well. Motti, who we saw, who recruited her. Some of the stories in the book, though, appear not to be terribly accurate. When you speak to Bunty about it, he tells the story of a Ukrainian relative coming back after the Holocaust, but that's all fabricated. That's like much in the world of undercover spy. No one knows what's truth and what isn't truth.
Well, I think that one must be cautious, because in actual fact, I started using Motti's book as the benchmark for my treatment until Bunty disabused it. There's no surprise that Motti collaborated with Ramoren, who's considered the equivalent of Israel's Jeffrey Archer. I would buy the book with caution, that it's not telling an entirely factual story, but it's written to engage an audience and is preaching probably to the converted. But I think there's a great book to be had. I mean, John's love story, for a start, is a kickoff. But I would be cautious about the book. The other aspect is that Munich was based on an almost, I don't want to sort of use the term, a dubious novel with pretensions of having been authored by somebody in Mossad and the security services, when in actual fact he was a luggage handler at Ben Gurion. And Mossad to this day are peeved that somebody with the means that Steven Spielberg had chose to film in Malta and not Israel, where he would have had all the cooperation required to realize the film. And to not know, again, with all the resources he had at his disposal and the financing that he had at his disposal, to not know that the Daniel Craig character was in actual fact a woman is, I think, negligent, but that's my personal view.
Lynette, there are questions that have come in to ask, is Aeneas still alive?
No.
Well, let's, Lynette, did you have any contact with Aeneas after Sylvia's passing?
Not much. Because of the distance, you know, with him in Pretoria and then back in Norway, and yeah, so limited contact with Aeneas, sadly.
Aeneas passed away, I think, in 2014. So quite a long time.
He passed away, Derek, 3 months after I completed the film in 2015, and strangely, actually saw the rest of his life out very comfortably in a Jewish retirement home in Oslo. And he was very well looked after, immaculately dressed every day that we interviewed. He couldn't understand that I needed him to wear the same shirt over the 2 days of filming, because he had never worn a shirt for more than 1 day.
2 days in a row. Yeah.
But he complied, and he, as ever, was a gentleman. And I think it was very nice that he and Bunty had time together. Bunty saw a lot of him while we were filming. And
so we can,
a real gentleman.
Sorry, Derek?
Yeah, can I butt in? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Dave.
Yeah, I just want to butt in because I think this is kind of like very informative and illuminating of the exchange of letters that took place between Judge Joseph Herbstein and Sylvia when she was incarcerated. I don't know if people are familiar with Judge Joseph Herbstein. He was a judge of the Supreme Court in Cape Town. He wrote the definitive book, I think, on civil procedure for us lawyers, you remember, together with L. van Vinsen. And he immigrated to Israel in 1963. In 1971 to 1974, he was the chairman of the South African Zionist Federation in Israel, commonly referred to as Telfed. And it was during this period of his chairmanship that he struck up this exchange of letters with Sylvia in jail. What is interesting is they both share commonality in that they both are from Graaff-Reinet. Judge Herbstein also was born and grew up in Graaff-Reinet. So that was his opening to Sylvia when he wrote his first letter to her. And how do I know about this? Because a week or two after the movie was shown here in Israel, Saxon's movie, I was contacted by Nina Siltz, who is the daughter of Judge Herbstein living in Savillon. And she said, I have all these letters written between Sylvia and Judge Herbstein. Do I want them? Well, of course I want them. So here I am sitting with this correspondence. And I think because it's correspondence between the two of them, I think it's quite informative. So in one, Judge Herbstein writes to her and says, as chairman of South African Zionist Federation, I'm glad to offer you our services. If you should need any, please write. And then followed an exchange of letters. But what's interesting now, because we've discussed the nature of the Jewishness, and Judge Herbstein says this in one letter, expressing pleasure with her father for, quote, imbuing you so fully with his Jewishness as to influence you to come out so strongly on our side, end quote. And then in another, Sylvia writes back to Judge Herbstein, and I don't know what preceded this, but she writes to Judge Herbstein saying the following, I think you rather underestimate my father's Jewishness. And I can't quite read this because it's blocked, because when you say that he said that, no, he was, and she goes on, he was exceedingly proud of being a Jew. Just did not approve of the trappings. And then she goes on to say, to write, but never that my father was a Jew in every proud sense of the word. And then she goes later to say, where does that leave me? And she says here in bold, a fervent Zionist. And I think this is very interesting, very illuminating. After all, these are the precise words of Sylvia from jail.
So we're going to do one last swing through the panel because time has gotten late. But before we do that, we'd love to know if the people who watched tonight thought tonight was fascinating, interesting, informative, entertaining. And we'd also like to know what you thought of Sylvia now having heard the story. So please, in the chat section, we still have on Zoom alone, we've got over 2,000 people still watching us on Zoom, and we've been going nearly 2.5 hours. We've got lots of people on YouTube as well, thousands of people on YouTube as well. So please, in the comment section, as we do the last roundup of our panel, before we show, in fact, the trailer for Saxon's movie, his documentary, please just put in the chat, we'll share it with everyone, what you thought of tonight. Did you enjoy it? Was this a remarkable story of an absolutely remarkable woman that we told during Women's Month in South Africa? So Derek, let's start off with you. She is family, she is blood. Will she be remembered as a heroine, as a traitor, as an assassin? How do you think Sylvia will be remembered?
I think there's no doubt, it depends where you are. And I know that in Israel, there are special memorials to her, as Saxon was saying. So she will not be forgotten. And I know some top Mossad officials have said that we'll never know the full story, but she was one of their best operators. I will remember her as very similar to my sister, very striking. And in fact, when those pictures were of her, when after Lilyhammer, she was compared to Gaynor, who was a model back in Zimbabwe. And I think you know that Sylvia also modeled in Paris, I think. So there was this connection, and they're both very striking, women, and both very warm. And I'll remember, the good times that I met her, and I'm just so glad that I did meet her, because I could have spent the rest of my life not met her at all. And I'm also glad that that night that I came and chatted to Sackstein, and this led to the movie that he's made. I think that was just very fortunate. And to everybody in the panel, I've just learned so much more about Sylvia that it's been just wonderful for me to hear the stories and to think what an amazing woman she was in every respect. And I just really want to thank you, Howard, for inviting me. And I've really enjoyed being part of this panel and contributing just a small amount.
Derek, I'm not going to ask you what it's like to be interviewed.
Well, that was one of the things that I had in common with Sylvia, is that she loved talking about journalism, because as we said earlier, that her cover was as Patricia Roxburgh, and that was as a photojournalist. So she felt that was our bond, that we were both really journalists at heart. And yeah.
Fantastic. Lynette, tell us, how will you remember Sylvia?
That's an amazing question. I don't know. I remember her for all the very things that everybody has been speaking about this evening. Everything is true. She was truly an unusual, a fantastically talented, wonderful person. And I was privileged to have been her friend. And what more can I say than that?
John, in retrospect, do you feel affection? Do you feel betrayal? How do you remember Sylvia?
I feel affection, great affection. No sense of betrayal, goodness me. We were together, and that's what I remember. And I feel regret also that we lost touch. I did, when she was arrested in Norway, as we've told, as we all heard, I did try and get in touch with her, but I never got a reply. And I think she closed down this chapter in her life, which was brief for her, but important for me. So I do look back with great fondness and affection to her, and also amazement that I had this brush with international espionage. It was Israeli, without being aware of it. Not great for a journalist, really.
Dave Kaplan, it's been 45 years since she left the service of the Mossad, and yet we still don't know many of the details. How do you think will Israel ever release the information, and how will she be remembered in Israel?
All right. I said to you right at the beginning, it began for me at her end, and it hasn't ended. This story, this saga continues. And if you remember in the movie, if you watched carefully, Eitan Harbour in the translated section said, referring to the people of Israel, he said, people of Israel, you should go at least 3 times a week to her grave and lay wreaths on the grave until it reaches the heaven for what she has done for you. Now that's an amazing way of expressing it, because it begs the question, what did she do? The story about Lilyhammer is only one small chapter in a huge saga about her contribution, and we don't know it. But what was interesting, when Sackstein came to Israel and we had the premiere in Israel in Ra'anana, and that line from Eitan Harbour about laying wreaths on a grave clearly resonated with an audience, which was packed. Because the next day, people started phoning us and saying, we want to lay wreaths on the grave of Sylvia Raphael. And from that day, it started. Every year, we have a tekes, we have a celebration, we have a ceremony at the graveside of Sylvia at Ramat HaKovesh, where we talk about Sylvia, and we have meetings which we address all over the country. My last one was in Ashkelon in November before Corona, where I addressed a large South African audience on Sylvia. So the movie, and I spoke about it. So this is ongoing, and it will continue going on because people want to know more. I don't know when we'll know as much as we want to know, and maybe we shouldn't, because maybe there's information that shouldn't be revealed. But that makes it all the more exciting and all the more mysterious. And if we talk about Sylvia's legacy, and that's why the legacy is not about Sylvia. As I said, this is a small chapter. I think that her contribution, if by going in the words of another great South African Israeli, Abba Eban, who was born in Cape Town and became Israel's the Minister of Foreign Affairs, when he said, Israel's future will be longer than its past. In other words, it will have eternal continuity. And I think Sylvia's contribution gives meaning to those words in terms of the salvation of the Jewish people in Israel.
So Saxon, we're going to come for last comment to you in 1 second. Just before we do that, I want to thank Danny Kadar, who's been controlling all the back end tonight. A huge thank you to Danny. A huge thank you to Petter, who's putting on Thursday night's webcast, where we're going to be looking at ISIS in South Africa. So we'll see everyone on Thursday. And a massive thank you to Pam May Roberts, who did all of the video editing tonight. Saxon, she took much of your material. She took stuff from CNN. She took stuff from multiple sources to be able to give us information tonight. Pam, a brilliant job, Pam May Roberts. A huge thank you for everything that you've done. And also, let us not forget, Dorothy Sank made this entire thing possible, as did Leanne Copenhagen, who has pursued the story for years to make sure that the story gets told. So to both of them, a massive thank you. Saxon, before we show the trailer for your movie, and we certainly hope, in fact, that it gets shown in South Africa, because you've seen tonight, the interest has been absolutely immense. We've had thousands and thousands of people watching us tonight. Tell us how you think Sylvia will be remembered.
I think personally, certainly from an Israeli perspective, she's a superheroine. There's no other way of describing her. And she's part legend, part factual. It's the way she is. I think Lynette's right. She probably did go to Israel and explore her roots. I think the most important thing to remember about Sylvia is she did what she did because of what happened in the 1930s and 1940s. She was absolutely horrified by that egregious part of history. And she, in a sense, made it her sort of own private covenant that she would do everything in her power to protect the Jewish people and their homeland. And one mustn't forget that. She really did have a very strong sense of that historical dynamic that she never wanted to see repeated again. And I think that one of the reasons that my film has such a long, evergreen sort of quality to it is that strangely it seems to be an antidote to the hideous, unthinking anti-Semitism that we experience today in Europe and the United States and other parts of the world. So I think she will be remembered, and eventually there will be historians that are able to have access to her missions and operations. But so much is protected because she has colleagues still alive who are still working. One anecdote, her principal wet worker is 83 years old. And guess what? He's still working. Can you imagine? He's still working.
So, sorry, what is a wet worker?
It's the person that does the shooting and presses the trigger for the bomb. She had a personal wet worker who worked with her for most of her life, her professional life, and he is still alive and at great expense to Mossad is kept hidden, but he is still working, and we were confronted by Mossad to obscure him more than he's revealed in the film. We got around that, but we were in no uncertain terms told that he had to be protected because he's still at work.
In fact,
Bunty, 82-year-old assassin.
Bunty tells the story that when he came back to the kibbutz after visiting Sylvia in prison, he visits Bunty and says, "Draw me a scaled model of her cell. I want to go break her out."
And he would be perfectly capable of doing it, I'm sure. But he was mad about her, and you know, so that just, it's in a humorous way gives you some idea why so much of Sylvia's work cannot be, or Mossad cannot allow it to be extrapolated in any way by the enemies of Israel.
Thank you to the most remarkable, illustrious panel. Thank you to literally the thousands and thousands of people who've joined us this evening. We hope we'll be able to see the full story, Sylvia tracing blood, on our screens. Hopefully, Derek, maybe you go take it to DSTV and explain to them the interest that Tonight has in fact done. And I think it's a remarkable story that every South African should be aware of. We're going to play out with the trailer for Saxon's documentary, and we'll see you all again on Thursday evening.
Thank you, Howard.
Cheers, not.
C'était quelqu'un qui avait vraiment une belle femme d'abord, mais avec de la classe. Hein. Et puis, ne disant pas n'importe quoi.
There was something fascinating and compelling about her, because there was a part of her which you could never quite reach or touch.
אני יכול לומר בקלות רבה מאוד ובאחריות רבה מאוד שהיא הייתה מהלוחמות היותר מוצלחות של המוסד.
Where you have a filmmaker like Steven Spielberg making the film Munich, which involves Sylvia. As a character, though, is played by Daniel Craig, the current James Bond.
I don't think Sylvia's part was known by Spielberg. He based it on the book, and that's the only reference he had.
She was walking amongst the most dangerous people in the world in the late 60s and 70s. If she had to pull this off and not lose her life, she had to fool the best, and she did.
Only Mossad knows what other deadly operations she carried out on the service's behalf. I wonder how many other journalists she charmed with her smile to give her cover for her spying. I shall always look back with amazement at my brush with the world of international espionage, and the fact that the lovely girl I had known was a spy who killed in cold blood.
אילו עם ישראל היה יודע כמה מגיע לכבוד, הוא היה עולה לרגל לקברה בקיבוץ רמת הכובש, אם אני זוכר נכון, פעמיים בשבוע, ומניח זרי פרחים עד גובה השמיים.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll leave the chat open for the next minute or two so people can leave us the final comments. But to this remarkable panel of people, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, Howard.
Yes,
Amazing to
good
see
night,
you all.
Very much.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, John.
Bye-bye, guys. Talk soon.
Okay, I can go.